After buying an all-purpose zoom lens, the next lens that I would buy when getting into a new camera system is a large maximum aperture wide-angle lens. Generally, that's 12 to 13 millimeters on APS-C sensor cameras, and this was not only great for wraparound environments like forest, caves, and historic buildings, but the large maximum aperture is also great for astrophotography. But when I got into the Canon RF mount, with the Canon R50, R10, and R7, there was no lens like this. That's because Canon was using the patent on its autofocus system to stop third-party lens manufacturers from making lenses for the RF mount. And this has long been a thing on Canon's APS-C camera systems. Canon has always made affordable entry-level lenses, but if you wanted something better, you generally had to look at one of the third-party manufacturers. This was often Sigma, Tamron, or Samyang, and Canon has finally given permission to make RF lenses to a number of these manufacturers. But this lens by Samyang is probably the one that I'm most excited about, and that's because I've owned a version of this lens on Canon EFM, Fuji X, Sony E, and now it's available for Canon RF. This is the Samyang 12mm f2 autofocus lens. It's a new release lens, so I'll put some links in the description down below to the best pricing I could find on the lens and where it's currently available. This lens was given to me by Samyang, but Samyang has not paid me or had any say in the making of this video. I think somebody looking at one of these new third-party lenses has probably got the kit lens already, so I'm just going to bring in the kit lens so we can have a little comparison between the two lenses, just in build quality and what you're going to get and what to expect out of this Samyang lens. To start with, we just have a look at the Samyang, and we've obviously got a metal lens mount instead of a plastic lens mount. The Samyang itself has a nice premium rubber focus ring grip around the outside, where the kit lens is just plastic. Overall, the kit lens basically feels cheap. It comes in the kit for an extra $100, and it kind of feels like that. It almost feels disposable, in fact. And while the Samyang is still reasonably light, it's definitely a little bit heavier than the kit lens. It does have a plastic body. It also has a rubber sealing gasket on the outside, so you've got some weather sealing there. It does also come with a lens hood. And overall, it's just a much nicer, more premium feeling lens versus the kit lens. But as you can see, it's still like a reasonably compact lens. And I certainly wouldn't say that the lens feels like a pro photography lens or one of Canon's L-mount lenses, but it certainly feels like a significant step up from the kit lens. And for me, the 12mm focal length is quite a special immersive storytelling lens. And that's because when you use this lens, particularly in an environment that wraps around you, you feel immersed in the environment that you're in. You feel like you are part of the scene when you look at that photo or video. And we'll often hear people say that 50 millimeters is the equivalent of what the human eye can see. And I think that's said because if you think about what somebody looks like in real life, and then you think of a photo or you see a photo of them taken with a 50mm lens, you think, yes, that reasonably represents the way I see them. It gives them a very natural perspective. But if you ever think about traveling and you're in a busy city or in a cave or in a forest or in some environment that just wraps around you, maybe you're in a historic church and you think, wow, this is just so magnificent. I want to capture this in photo or video, share it when I get home, and remember it. If you pull out a 50mm lens, it is not even going to remotely represent what you're seeing. And that's because the human eye can see so wide. We have a huge wide field of view, and the 50mm field of view is much, much more narrow. But this lens gives you that kind of wraparound, immersive image, that kind of perspective. And because of that, I think it's wide-angle lenses like this that give you the best chance of representing these beautiful immersive environments. But importantly, 12 millimeters, although it is significantly wide, it's not so incredibly wide that it feels completely unnatural. But what you do get with a 12mm lens is something called perspective distortion. And perspective distortion is a very powerful thing to use in your photos or videos, but you also have to be aware of how it's going to affect the images that you're capturing. And what perspective distortion is on wide-angle lenses like this, the closer you get to a subject, the more that subject fills the frame, and all the things in the background get pushed away. So the object that's close to the lens seems bigger in comparison to the things off in the distance. And because of that, we can use perspective distortion to play with our images in creative ways, and particularly when you get very close to something, you will get this very interesting, surreal perspective distortion effect. Importantly, importantly, you need to understand that perspective distortion is something that you get with wide-angle lenses. It's actually a feature of using a wide-angle lens. It's unlike barrel distortion or pincushion distortion, which are seen as optical flaws or traits of the lens itself. All wide-angle lenses give you the ability to have perspective distortion. And you also have to be aware of the way this perspective distortion affects your images. So if you want to take a flattering portrait of someone, you don't want to get the lens like straight up in their face or very close to one of their limbs or one of their body parts, because that's going to distort the way the person looks. Now, this lens is going to be great for a number of things, but the first thing that hits me is travel. This is going to get you that wraparound environment when you're walking through a city, walking through a scene, going onto a cruise ship, in a bar at night or in a low light restaurant or something like that. You're going to be able to use the f2 aperture on this lens. This is going to get you great low light performance. This also makes it great for architecture and real estate, particularly historic buildings, historic churches, things like this. And it's almost at perfect focal length where it makes the rooms or the space seem a little bit bigger than what it is, but doesn't dramatically distort it to the point where it's completely unrealistic. It gives you that kind of larger than life real estate photography type vibe. So this is a very, very good lens for that. And once again, I know a bunch of people that started their real estate careers on using a Samyang 12mm f2 lens. The other thing you're going to be able to use this lens for is vlogging. And that's because, once again, you can turn the lens on yourself. It's going to show you, but it's also going to show the environment around you and give some context to where you are, where a tighter lens is just going to be cropped in your face, really doesn't tell the story. This is almost that sort of perfect focal length, somewhere between sort of 12 and 15 millimeters, I think is ideal for vlogging, and that's going to do it very well for you. The other thing that I love using this lens for is astrophotography. Once again, you've got this huge wide field of view. You can set a lighthouse or a tree or a house in the foreground, and then you can get this wraparound sky and stars in the background. And going down to f2, you're going to get this great low light performance. And the optics on this lens are really ideal for astrophotography, and they perform really well. The other thing this lens does particularly well is take close focus photos. And that is super fun because when you're traveling, you might have some details in an environment that you want to capture. You can get very, very close to the object. You also get this really surreal effect where the small item is very close to the lens and then it pushes everything away. So once again, you're playing with this perspective distortion to get this really interesting looking image that you can only do with a wide lens that has reasonably good close focus ability. And there's really only one negative thing I would say about this lens, and it's not really about this lens, it's just about wide focal lengths in general, and that is 12 millimeters can be very challenging for a new photographer to compose an image with. And that's because there is so much in the scene that you really have to think about your image composition and try to make a sort of moving image. There are a couple tips that I'll give you, and the first one is sometimes when you've got a really wide angle lens, you'll have very bright spots and very dark spots because you're capturing so much of the environment, and just underexposing a little bit can help compensate for that so you don't blow out those highlight areas. The other thing is I find this lens is easier for a new photographer to actually shoot in portrait orientation and then slightly tip it down. That means that you're going to get a little bit more of the foreground, but by turning it into portrait orientation, you're taking the widest part of the image here, which is left and right, which is going in all directions because we live in a world that goes like this. Turning it like this actually kind of cleans up the image a bit, and it makes it easier to get cleaner edges of frame. And the third tip I would have is when taking photos, think about your foreground elements, the things that are closest to the camera. Even if there's a person in the scene, if there's something closer to the lens than them, then that is going to be an element that seems quite prominent in the scene. So you really have to think about those foreground elements and how they're going to relate to whatever the subject matter is in the photograph. And the other thing this happens to be pretty good for is like all-purpose video, because 12 millimeters is reasonably wide and it's a reasonably stable focal length. So because it's so wide, when you move your hands and move the camera, the actual images doesn't move very much because the lens is so wide. If you can imagine, if you're zoomed in and you move the lens, it's actually going to move more. And because of this, the cameras tend to be able to stabilize the footage reasonably well with the digital or in-body image stabilization. The only thing you have to be careful of is sometimes you can get wobbly corners if you don't have proper handheld technique or you're moving the lens around too much. But the other thing about this lens being 12 millimeters. If you bring it into editing, your videos tend to be very easy to stabilize, once again, because there's not as much movement when you have sort of hand movement in a scene. Given this is a Canon approved lens, we get a number of features in this lens which are very good. To start with, it works very well with the Canon RF autofocus system. It works every bit as well as the kit lenses or any of Canon's own made lenses. The other thing it does is it works with all of Canon's in-camera corrections. So vignette, distortion, chromatic aberration, and diffraction are all compensated for in camera. And if you don't know what any of that means, don't worry about it. But just quickly touching on the image quality, the flare control is very, very good and very similar to the first party lens manufacturers. Samyang's been around for a while and they've figured it out, and they really are on par with any of the first party brands. The lens is also exceptionally sharp, particularly in the center of frame. Not quite as sharp at the corners, but nothing that I would worry about. Also, you can shoot it at f2 wide open. You won't have any problems. Great for astrophotography, but it is a very sharp lens overall, and it's way sharper than the kit lens that you would have gotten with your camera. And the bokeh is pleasing when you get it. You're not going to get deeply out of focus backgrounds, but when you get close to something, you can get an out of focus background. And when you do, it's nice and smooth and pleasing and not distracting. So this is an ultra sharp lens that can be used for everything from travel and blogging to real estate and architecture, and even be used for astrophotography. It's going to be sharper than your kit lens, better in low light, is designed from the start to work with the Canon RF system, and that includes in-camera corrections and autofocus that works just like the Canon-made lenses. So I think this really could be a no-brainer upgrade for somebody currently shooting with a kit lens, with my only caveat being that new photographers may find the 12mm focal length a little bit challenging at first until they learn to compose with wide-angle lenses. Now, buying a new lens is only one way to improve your photos, and if you want to take better photos for free, I've just thrown a video on screen now. This is the best video I've ever done on the basic concepts of photography and camera settings, and I'd be very surprised if you watch that video to the end and aren't a better photographer at the end of that video than you are right now.